Not only should we be worried about to what degree are political views being truncated on the faculty, but we also ought to worry about to what degree are political views being truncated among the students.
Keith Whittington, professor of politics from Princeton. Thanks for coming to AEI.
Thank you.
So you've written a timely new book, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. This is timely and in the air. One of the central theses of your book is that free speech is central to the mission of a modern university. Why is that, first of all? Just pin down the basics, and where are we going awry?
Yeah, so I think it's important fundamentally because universities are at heart truth-seeking institutions. They're places where we're trying to advance the state of human knowledge and then communicate what we've learned about that. Communicate it to students, communicate it to other academics, communicate it ultimately to the general public. And that means the universities need to be places where you can examine unconventional ideas, you can challenge received wisdom, and you can really play out arguments and see how they lead. And that requires giving people a fair amount of space to be able to explore ideas, sometimes to make mistakes, to do things that seem extraordinarily controversial. And we learn things from people engaging in those controversies and exploring ideas, including mistaken ideas. And so if universities are going to be ultimately committed to that core mission of trying to improve human understanding, then they need to be places where people have a lot of freedom to experiment with ideas.
Well, how are we doing? I mean, we hear lots of things about, conflict on college campuses over what's acceptable and what's not. I mean, I have a bunch of questions here, but how would you describe the state of free speech in campus today? Right.
I think on the whole, we're doing reasonably well, actually. So I think it's easy to panic a little bit, in part because we see some very high-profile examples of things going badly. We should take those problems seriously, but at the same time, we don't want to overreact. So it's hard to know, for example, whether some of the things that we're seeing in the press that show up on YouTube as examples of students being particularly intolerant or universities behaving badly, whether those are indicative of increasing incidents of problems on campuses, or if they're just more visible than they used to be. It's also true, I think, that we should not lose sight of what is true about liberal democracy more generally. And it's not only true of the current students on current college campuses, but it's been true of American society for a long time, which is Americans in general say they like free speech. And they've long said they like free speech. So if you ask Americans in the 1940s, they would have told you we're very committed to free speech. If you ask them now, they would tell you we're very committed to free speech. But if you start confronting them with specific examples of speech that they find offensive or controversial or dangerous, they start qualifying, they start backing away, they start making exceptions. And the students now are not that different. They may have particular things they're objecting to, but in general, they have the same problems we all have, which is it's easy to say you're tolerant. It's much harder to be tolerant.
Yeah, well, it's hard to find opponents of liberty and free speech until you get down to brass tacks. So give me some examples here of how, reasonable desires to curb hate speech or, something that really should, in many view, be excluded from public dialogue. How does this play out in campuses and what's getting carved out?
Right. So I think there's two kinds of things we ought to worry about. One, and think through. One is thinking about campus policies. So what kinds of things do we want to restrict and say are completely outside the bounds, if anything? And I think in general, campus policies ought to be very open. We don't want to draw very much in the way of saying things are completely out of bounds, and we don't want that talked about on our campus. On the other hand, we want to think about sort of within those sets of rules and policies, what's most productive to talk about? Who ought we to bring to campus to have a conversation with? What kinds of debates should we be engaged in? Because there are important decisions to be made about where can we best advance knowledge, what are the most productive sets of views to engage with. It doesn't make sense to be spending a lot of our time trying to elevate things that are very marginal and ultimately extreme and not very important, and give them outsized importance by spending a lot of time talking about them on college campuses. And sometimes it can be tempting to do that.
Yeah.
So we want the right kind of policies, but we also want to be thinking about what it is we're doing
Right.
more carefully as well.
Well, there are things that get a lot of attention.
Right.
Weather and culture should be able to come to campus.
Right.
Or Milo or these other characters.
Right.
These are sort of fringe activities, right? They seem like they're not central to most students. So my question is, what in all these things that we see in the newspaper are sort of clown shows that we shouldn't really pay a whole lot of attention to? And then if that's the case, where should we be concerned where the rubber really is hitting the road?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of those things are sort of relatively marginal to what we think of as really the core things the universities are supposed to be doing. I mean, the basics is what's happening in the classroom, what kind of teaching is occurring, what kind of research is occurring, what kind of scholarship is being produced.
Yeah.
Those are the things that really matter a lot. Some of the things that are high profile and visible often are not as important. So what kind of outside speakers are campus groups inviting to campus?
Sure.
And what their reception looks like. What kind of commencement speakers you have. And so it can be very embarrassing for a university if a commencement speaker creates a protest or gets disinvited. In and of itself, it's not that important who the commencement speaker is and what they're doing on campus. That's not at the heart of what the institutional mission is. What you worry about, though, is what that says about the campus culture. And so what's happening on a day-to-day basis that this is exposing. So the fact that people can't tolerate hearing Ann Coulter, that they can't tolerate hearing a Republican politician as a commencement speaker, that is suggestive that there may be deeper problems there that's affecting the way classroom conversations go, what kind of research gets conducted, what more general student conversations look like.
Yeah, let's dig down on that because that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, how does the convolutions around free speech and whatever the restrictions are influence who's in the academy, what they are allowed to pursue? I mean, certainly there are folks on the right who are going to say, well, there are conservative views that are not allowed to be explored empirically because they're controversial. And then there are some, more tangential things that can become a whole field of study.
Sure, right. No, and there are hard empirical questions about sort of what drives that. So one thing I think that is that cannot be reasonably disputed is that the academy leans very left. Most professors are on the left. They've become more left-leaning over time. So the academy is much more liberal than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when it still tilted left, but not as dramatically as it does now. And it tilts left really across the board. And so sometimes people try to say, well, the economics department doesn't really tilt left, or the business school doesn't tilt left, but that's not true either. It turns out those are actually pretty left-leaning as well. So there's no question, I think, that university faculty and university administrators tend to lean to the left. And then the concern is, well, what's driving that and what are the consequences of that? And so I think we ought to be really worried if it has big consequences about what kind of classroom conversations can occur, what's being taught in the classroom. And we ought to be concerned if it affects scholarship in significant ways, such that some kinds of hypotheses are not being tested adequately, if people aren't adequately skeptical about sets of ideas. And there's certainly some evidence that both those things happen, that sometimes people behave badly in the classroom and that scholarship isn't as careful as it might otherwise be.
Can you give a specific example on that illuminates it?
Sure. So I think, so for example, one place to think about this is in law schools. And law schools are interesting in part because they're all about arguments and about trying to marshal arguments, and they have a direct connection to the outside world. And so law schools have to worry about training lawyers who can be practicing professionals, who can go out and argue in front of judges in the real world, and a lot of those judges are conservative. So it's particularly disturbing then if in the context of law schools, students aren't being exposed to conservative arguments, don't know how to analyze them, can't really think through what those conservative arguments look like, because they're just not being well prepared then to go out and engage the wide range of arguments they're going to see in the broader world. And I think a lot of left-leaning law faculty try very hard to represent conservative arguments in their classrooms because they know it's important for students to understand those. But we might worry that they can't be represented as well, that students won't hear them as often enough, and that faculty as well as students will be taken by surprise by sets of arguments that those faculty simply don't think about or don't think very deeply about because they don't fundamentally believe them. So it's more useful to actually have some conservative voices on your campus advocating those views, developing those arguments so people can see them playing out.
Yeah, this sounds in the campus context a lot like what we hear about free speech in the broader country.
Right.
And there are tensions between different folks as to how they think about those things. What's specific about the academic context that folks need to understand?
Right. I think there's a lot of overlap between what we ought to be worried about in the general society and what we ought to be worried about specifically on college campuses, in part because of that problem of polarization, information bubbles that we sort of worry about in other contexts, also matter in the college campus context. One of the things that's distinctive about university settings, though, is that we are trying to advance the frontiers of human knowledge, and part of why we ought to value diverse views is because it's helpful in that project, that you want people to be able to challenge your ideas and bring new ideas to the table. And if everybody's thinking the same, it's going to be less likely that's going to happen. It's easier for bad ideas to skate through because people aren't thinking about all the problems with them because they reinforce their prior expectations and the like. And so I think in the university context, we should worry about these issues for that kind of particular reason. It's important more generally in society that people learn to live together peacefully, learn to be able to settle their arguments through conversation rather than through violence and the like, and that's true on college campuses as well. But we have a particular interest in being able to hear a wide range of views just because it helps us advance the truth. And that's something that maybe society as a whole grapples with less often than we grapple with it on university campuses, but it's crucial to what we do.
Yeah. You know, you write in your book that your political inclinations might charitably be called outside the mainstream of university faculty, particularly as a political scientist. So as a somewhat heterodox academic, have you had experiences with pushing back? And we don't need to tell tales about Princeton, but I'm just interested, what does this feel like on the ground as a faculty member?
I think it varies a lot as to where you are, actually. So Princeton's reasonably good about this, and so I've been sort of fortunate, I think, in most of my work. So it's a routine feature of being an academic in the United States that you walk into a room, and if you're a conservative, you can expect that you're in the minority, maybe the extreme minority. Yeah. And so it's routine that everybody assumes that everybody in the room is on the same page. They basically agree with each other about lots of politics and values and the like, and that shapes conversation. And as well as sort of academic discourse per se. But I think I've been much more fortunate in my circumstances than faculty elsewhere have been as I talk to people in other institutions where they feel very uncomfortable talking about political things on campus. They feel like there's no-go zones, the things they just can't explore in the classroom as well as in the research as well as in sort of informal conversations because it wouldn't be received well by students or by other faculty members. And so there's a lot of self-censorship by faculty that worry about what other faculty are going to think, what other students are going to think.
Sure. Yeah, and that self-censorship can really be an issue, it seems to me. I'm curious. There's a lot of links between free speech and hate speech and the desire to have diverse campuses. All those things are laudable when done well. What about the concern for viewpoint diversity? I mean, we have a diverse set of viewpoints fueling American politics right now. They're very different. I'm not sure that they always get a fair hearing from both sides on campuses. So what's the status of viewpoint diversity on campuses, and how does it fare in this era of free speech concerns?
Yeah, so I worry that we're not getting a fair range of views expressed on college campuses. It's very disconcerting if we find that college campuses are less tolerant of the kind of political debate that you can find on cable talk shows. Campuses ought to be places where anything goes, wide-ranging conversations can be had, where ideas are taken very seriously. And I do worry that on a lot of campuses we are in a place where universities are less willing to take ideas seriously or less willing to tolerate things that are at least unconventional on their own campus, even if they're quite conventional in American society more generally. So I think universities have to be very cautious about not drawing those boundaries so narrowly that they cut themselves off from basic American political discourse, let alone the sort of the wide range of ideas they ought to be thinking about more carefully in general. And that plays out both in terms of what kind of faculty do you have on campus, and so what kind of scholars are you engaged in, what kind of teachers you're engaged with, but it also affects things like what student groups are doing and what students are doing on campus. So some of the controversies we see on campus are a function of the fact that American universities have traditionally allowed students a lot of flexibility and freedom to bring controversial speakers to campus, to hold their own events. We try to give students a lot of space to carve out their own political and intellectual debates on college campuses. And it's good for the intellectual freedom on a campus that students have a lot of opportunity to do that. And so not only should we be worried about to what degree are political views being truncated on the faculty, but we also ought to worry about to what degree are political views being truncated among the students, such that the students themselves can't learn new ideas, explore the range of ideas, engage ideas seriously at a point in their lives when they're trying to make up their mind about what they think about the world.
Yeah. So let's say as we are working with college campuses to get free speech right, what are the valid concerns of folks who seek to constrain free speech to make sure that there are safe spaces? They have some valid concerns. What's their best argument?
So I think there are genuine concerns that some of the things that provoke controversy are very marginal to the truth-seeking function of universities. Some individual figures that might be brought to campus, some modes of expression that we might worry about, don't do very much to advance ideas in a serious way. And we spend a lot of time then worrying about those kind of episodes, and they get an outsized amount of attention given their relative importance.
Particularly in the mainstream media.
Especially in mainstream media, but even on college campuses, they wind up absorbing a lot of attention and effort to try to work through those things when they aren't as fundamental as to what we're trying to do at the heart of universities on the whole. And so I think it's important for those who are off campus to not get overly excited when they see these sort of visible incidents of embarrassing things happening on campus, whether it's the function of a particular speaker getting shouted down, or it's a professor saying something stupid on social media, that those things happen, but that those are also isolated incidents, generally speaking. And we don't want to reshape the academic landscape in order to try to address those things. They're in fact exceptional and unusual. What we ought to be more focused on is trying to think about how do universities' classrooms operate, how is the faculty constituted, is student speech in general adequately protected. And some of that's about what kind of policies campuses adopt, some of it's about the culture that's in place.
Well, let's talk about those policies. I mean, if we want to get this right moving forward, and you're either the dean of a college all the way up to the president of a university or board of trustees, what kind of policies will secure viewpoint diversity, free speech on campus, and reasonable protections?
So on the one hand, I think universities have an important concern with thinking about they want to prevent students threatening each other. They want to prevent people on the campus community harassing each other. And so they need policies that are designed to minimize violence, minimize threats of violence, minimize intimidation, minimize harassment. And the problem with a lot of those policies is you don't want those to be so sweeping that they actually undermine our ability to engage in serious argument and discuss serious ideas. And often those policies do wind up written in that kind of way and get deployed in that kind of way by campus administrators or by students who are seeking to shut down debates they find discomforting, and they use those kinds of policies as leverage to do it. So we need to be careful about how we write those kinds of codes of conduct for not only student behavior, but faculty and administrator behavior as well on campus. So they're focused on the kinds of behavior that we really do want to restrict while leaving as much freedom as possible for a robust discussion of ideas.
So let me push on that. What do we want to restrict?
Well, I think we want certainly to restrict actual threats against other people. We want to restrict, I think, ongoing harassment against other people. Students, as well as faculty, should be comfortable on campus and not think that they're being threatened by other members of the campus community. And there's no reason why universities shouldn't crack down on that kind of behavior. On the other hand, students and faculty alike will sometimes say they feel threatened by things that are in fact not threats. Instead, they're discussion of ideas they don't like. And universities should be deeply committed to protecting the ability of people to talk about ideas that some people don't like, that some people find disturbing, that they think that those ideas have dangerous tendencies, that nonetheless those ideas ought to be discussed on campus. And so we ought to draw a very firm distinction between actual threats and intimidation and threats of violence against individuals and the discussion of ideas more generally.
Right. Well, so on particularly on the conservative side of the fence, there's a bunch of people who are very concerned with all the upheaval that's been going on over the past year or two. It's been some while. A couple of questions. Is it more important to have this discussion now? Is this more of a concern now, or is this just the current wave of a discussion we've been having for decades?
I think in some ways it's the current wave, a discussion we've been having for decades. It does come in a bit of waves. So I think we can take, and I found myself, for example, on campuses taking things for granted for a while, where I assumed that people were generally committed to free speech, and I assumed that these cultures of skeptical inquiry were reasonably well protected and valued. And my worry now is that there are a lot of students and faculty and administrators, but also lots of people off campus that are not so committed to those ideas. And so it's important then to re-articulate and reaffirm why are these ideas actually important? What are universities actually all about? Students should know what they're signing up for when they come to a university campus. They should know what they're going to encounter when they get there and shouldn't be taken by surprise. And if we spend all our time talking about how wonderful the food in the cafeteria is and how there's going to be climbing walls for students to enjoy, they're going to expect a Starbucks experience rather than an academic experience. And they ought to recognize when they're going to get there that while they may enjoy nice food in the cafeteria and the dorms might be a lot nicer than they were when I was a student on campus, that at heart, universities are about discussing difficult ideas. And they're going to wind up encountering people who disagree with them deeply, and people who are going to be in challenging, deeply cherished beliefs. And if they're not willing to do that, then maybe the college experience is not right for them. But they ought to recognize that's part of what it means to go to college.
So you're saying that there's, to a degree, an increasing sort of consumer culture for students, and that's at the root of some of these problems.
I think it is at the root of some of these problems. I think there's certainly an ideological element to some of the concerns. There are people on campus who have a political mission that they're trying to advance on college campuses, and as a consequence are quite hostile to a set of ideas they see as challenging that. But I think it's often much more common that the problem is one of a consumerist mentality among students and parents, for example, but also among administrators, where administrators scramble if they think something's going to be controversial, that's going to give the university a black eye in the general public. And from that perspective, it's anything that sort of calls attention to a set of ideas that a lot of people are going to object to. And that's just a deeply problematic view about what it is you ought to be expecting on a college campus. And so when you find university presidents denouncing faculty for saying things that are controversial, you fundamentally then have a campus leader who doesn't understand what their own campus is for and what you ought to be doing. But that's driven by this consumerist mentality that, well, we don't want to do anything that's going to make the parents nervous. We don't want to do anything that might make the politicians nervous. And so best to keep our heads down, best not to do anything that's going to be publicly controversial. And that's subversive of what it is universities are all about.
If there was one area, one key point, one lever that you thought was the most near term to watch on these issues, which would it be?
So I think one starting point actually is for university faculty to reaffirm these principles. You need leadership on campuses. You need it from senior administrators like college presidents. But I think faculty have an important role to play. And I think often faculty have tended to want to sit back, take things for granted, assume things are going fine, leave a lot of things to campus administrators so they don't have to worry about it. I think instead it's important for faculty to come forward, emphasize those scholarly values at the heart of the university, to not let the university be defined by consumerist vision, but be defined by the things I think the faculty tend to care the most about, which is the academic features of the university campus. And then to become good role models for what it means to engage ideas seriously and productively, and be tolerant of ideas that you disagree with. And I think faculty can play a very important role then for showing students that it's possible to disagree vehemently with things, and yet nonetheless be willing to engage them, to be able to hear them out, to have productive conversations around them despite those disagreements. And if faculty hide away from doing that, I think it leaves students at sea as to how they ought to behave, and it leaves campus administrators with a freer hand than we'd really prefer.
Right. So Practice what you preach.
You have to practice what you preach. No, that's absolutely right. And universities ought to be places where we're practicing that, right? So it ought to be routinely the case that faculty are in the public sphere discussing important ideas, and students can see that. And it ought to be places where faculty are encouraging difficult conversations in classrooms, and students feel comfortable having difficult conversations in classrooms, and they can see that it's possible to make mistakes and be corrected. It's possible to test out ideas and see how far they carry you. And faculty ought to be encouraging students to be intellectually curious in the classroom rather than encouraging students to pull up filters and try to avoid things that might be challenging.
Right. Well, the book Speak Freely is it's short, it's readable. I won't ask you to be a spoiler, but I will ask you to speak freely one more time on it. And when you look out in the future in terms of the health of free speech on college campuses, are we headed for a nosedive, or are we holding steady? Where do you think we're headed?
So I'm optimistic, and I have to be a little optimistic because that's part of why you write a book, right? You write a book because you think people are persuadable. And so I'm hopeful that if you discuss these ideas, that you can help persuade people, help people recognize them, and take them more seriously. I've also been encouraged, I think, that we've had some very high-profile incidents that have opened people's eyes to what's happening on some college campuses, and a lot of people don't like what they see. And that includes not only politicians and voters and parents, but also includes a lot of faculty and campus leaders who now, I think, recognize there's more of a problem than they thought, and they're starting to take active steps to try to clean up college campuses. So I'm actually quite optimistic that we're going to be in a better place 5 and 10 years from now than we were a couple of years ago.
I'll break my promise and ask one more question. What about on the student front? Do you see leadership from students? Are students dissatisfied with this trajectory, or are they following where they're led?
I don't think they're following where they're led, but I think it's a mixed bag with students. I think a lot of students come to campus not fully understanding what they're getting into. And in part, a lot of them have very skeptical ideas about the idea of free speech, for example, and the robust exchange of views. The particular examples they've seen of those controversies are often not very appealing to them. So students look around and say, well, the only people who could possibly care about free speech are white supremacists, for example, because they see that as being where the conversation is, and they don't have enough historical perspective to recognize that, look, there was a time in which it was the socialists, it was the communists, it was the civil rights leaders who were being suppressed and had to latch hold of free speech. And so it's important to provide students with a little more perspective so they understand that it's not always the same targets all the time. Everybody has a stake in these issues. It's not just one side that has a stake in those issues. And I think it's also important to try to wake them up to what it is they're going to encounter on the campus, that a campus, if it's going to be valuable to them, if the college experience is going to be valuable to them, it should be a place where they're going to be exposed to interesting and new things they haven't thought about before, some of which they will reject. And some of them they'll think about for the first time, and they should be open to those experiences when they're arriving. And I think a fair number of students arrive on campus not expecting that, and sometimes not wanting that. They really would prefer not to have to encounter ideas they find disagreeable. And it's important for universities to try to lead students to a better appreciation of what it is they're there for.
Yeah. Well, it's a good book, and it's a worthy target of conversation, especially as we like to say here at AEI, for a healthy competition of ideas. So, Keith, thanks for coming by.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. That's the end of our discussion with Keith Whittington. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about free speech on campus, check the links in the description below.